When I first saw the CSS Typhon speakers that you can see sat there behind me, I thought they reminded me of a Sonus Faber speaker with a little bit of Wilson audio in there as well. And now I know more about them, that's not too far from the truth. So if that Italian-American mix or combination sounds appealing, well then of course, these are speakers well worthy of consideration. And for those who might not be aware, the CSS Typhon is a speaker collaboration project between CSS or Creative Sound Solutions, which are a speaker design and manufacturing company based in Michigan in the US, and they make and sell speaker kits, drivers and more. And they collaborated with Jay Lee from the YouTube channel Jay-Z Yagi to create the Typhon, a three-way floor-standing speaker with a novel aesthetic and interesting design, especially with the adjustable angle top speaker cabinet. But before we move on, I think it's important to clarify, yes, Jay is another hi-fi YouTuber, but I have never met him before. In fact, I've never even spoken to him before he contacted me and asked me if I'd like to review the Typhon speakers. So there is no conflict of interest here. And I also want to confirm that neither Jay nor CSS asked me to say anything in this review, which I really appreciated. So all the thoughts and opinions are 100% my own. But of course, if you'd like to know any more details than what I cover in this review, then I would suggest you check out Jay's videos, and I'll link a couple down there for you. But I did ask Jay some probing questions, such as what was the inspiration for the Typhon's design, and he told me that he took inspiration from all of the Wilson audio speakers he had installed for customers when he worked in hi-fi retail. And they took aesthetic inspiration from Sonus Faber speakers. And he told me that the overall goal with the Typhon was to create a speaker that was very close to larger floor-standing Wilson speakers for real-world money. And real-world is a phrase that I often use, but it doesn't really mean anything. And the Typhon cost $5,500, which of course is a lot of money for a pair of speakers, but much more real world when you're comparing to something like Wilson audio speakers. And they are purchased directly from the CSS website, so it's a straight from the manufacturer to the customer business model, rather than speakers being sold through dealers, with the pros and cons of that type of setup. But there is a 30-day home trial period with a returns policy, so make sure you read that policy to know how it works. And there is also shipping costs to consider in addition also. So what do we get for our hard-earned money? Well, for starters, 4 separate cabinets that come in 4 separate boxes. 2 are bass towers that use a pair of CSS's own 7-inch mid-bass drivers with a cone that's made from paper and fiberglass, although it looks more like paper, but with some nice design touches such as a copper cap to reduce inductance and distortion. And more interesting to me was the use of fiberglass voice coil formers, which is something that Dynaudio explained to me the benefits of when I visited their factory recently. And I'll link a video to that factory tour type video that I created for those. But essentially the voice coil former, or a fiberglass voice coil former, just means there's less resistance for the driver's pistonic motion within the mechanical mechanism. And what's really interesting about this is I didn't know any of this until right at the end of the review when I was doing my research. And I would have said that the Typhon's bass definitely reminds me of Dynaudio speakers bass in some ways. So this is really interesting to me because it makes me think, yeah, these technologies that go into speaker drivers, are they audible? Can we hear them? Maybe we can, in which case that makes them very important. The bass cabinet is rear-ported, or vented might be a better way to describe it, as there are some fins that are intended to control the airflow. The bass tower's design, I think, is intended to minimize the Typhon's footprint, which it does, but they are still large enough to allow for enough volume for a very good bass extension, which is claimed to 30 Hz anechoic or 20 Hz in room, with a plus or minus 3 dBs worth of variance, which is very impressive, and really it's all we need from modern full-range speakers. Well, on paper, of course, anyway. The bass towers are not overly heavy, so it's easy to move them around and place where you want. And I was told there is a lot of high-quality bracing going on inside the cabinet. But it's interesting, when you crack your knuckles on the bass tower cabinet, it definitely doesn't feel as inert as from a Wilson speaker. We can't really expect that. But they also didn't feel as inert as when I cracked my knuckles on the Wharfedale Elysian 3 speakers that I have here also at the moment. But interestingly, when you place the top speaker onto that bass cabinet and then wrap your knuckles on it again, everything feels much more inert. And it's interesting how that happens. So what I found interesting and impressive about that is that it seems like the Typhon is designed as a cohesive whole. You know, the top, the effect of the top is even designed to affect the bottom, even from a resonance point of view. So that to me was impressive, because it seems or shows or demonstrates that this is a cohesive whole as a speaker and not just two individual things that are put together. And then the two top speaker enclosures are sealed, and they feature the same 7-inch mid-bass driver with CSS's own LD25X 25mm or just under 1-inch silk dome tweeter, sitting in what looks like a waveguide. Now, interestingly, to secure the top speaker to the bass cabinet, there is a bar that runs along the front, and that stops the top speaker from sliding forwards, backwards, left or right. And then the really interesting thing is the angle adjustment mechanism that allows for up to 5 degrees of angle adjustment. And I asked Jay, what is this for? Why does the Typhon speaker need this? And he told me that it's designed to be an extra feature. He said he's seen a lot of audiophiles that raise or change the speaker's angle, raise the rear of their speakers to change the angle by increasing or raising the rear spikes on the speakers to put the tweeter more on axis to that listener while they're sitting and listening. And I assume this is more of maybe a large speaker thing, because it's not something that I've ever done before, but it's definitely something that I'm going to consider doing in the future. But of course, you don't need to worry about any of this with the Typhon, because you can just level the bass tower speaker and then you have up to 5 degrees worth of angle adjustment with just the top speaker. And it was interesting messing around with this mechanism, adjusting the angle of that top speaker. It makes a really big difference to how the speakers sound. And in principle, I really like this idea. I always like extra levels of control with the sound of an audio system. But in practice, this is a little bit of faff, and it adds some obvious extra complexity. Also, the mechanism is a little clunky, and I can't say I'm 100% sold on it, but I can tell it's been designed to be simple to use. You pull the lever out, and it releases a sprung type of mechanism for you to be able to make the adjustment. And there are markers so you can see how many degrees of angle that you have adjusted the speaker, so that you can set both of them to be the same. And of course, this seems simple enough, but I just found the whole mechanism to be just a little bit of faff in terms of kind of making the adjustments that I wanted. Maybe it's just me being clumsy. That's definitely a factor to consider. But it was interesting to me because I found that with that mechanism, if I overextended it a little bit too much, and that's possibly user error, then I could hear some mechanical vibration happening within the speakers when heavy bass was playing. However, I realized that's because I'd used the mechanism incorrectly. When you adjust the angle, you'll see that the speaker seems to lock into place. And soon as that mechanism locked into a position, well, then there was no vibration, or I couldn't hear any mechanical noise at all. When I asked Jay about this, he told me that the whole sprung mechanism is a very clever design in order to combat any mechanical vibrations, which it seems to do 100% effective once you've used that mechanism correctly. So just like I said, I'm not 100% sold on the usability of this mechanism, but I've got to say kudos to the guys for doing something different here, because it's brave to do something different in an industry like hi-fi with speakers when it's kind of, very stuck in its ways. So let's talk about sound quality. And it's interesting for me because I think the Typhons have some very obvious overriding sonic traits. But outside of that, what I've been hearing has been quite amplifier dependent. So we have a lot to talk about here. Starting with the overriding traits, the bass, I am sure, is intended to be Wilson audio speaker-like. So a big bass that adds scale and warmth, that famous Wilson warmth. But for me, the bass is also quite Dynaudio-like, as I mentioned before. So big, full, dynamic, and slightly rounded, so what I call pleasing bass. The mids and highs to me sounded very Sonus Faber-esque. So relaxed, warm vocals in the main, with a Sonus Faber-like treble. So a fairly easygoing treble, but still a very present one with a little bit of spice to it. But digging deeper, one of the big sonic strengths of the Typhon speakers is their bass delivery. And regulars to this channel will have heard me say the phrase, I wish those speakers gave me just a bit more bass, probably 100 or more times. But that's not the case with the Typhon speakers. I've been really impressed and totally satisfied for once with the bass output. You know, the size, scale, extension, the feel, the pressure of the bass. And it can be very powerful, it can be very full sounding and very punchy with the right amplifier, and also quite room hitting. So the Typhon had the effect of the bass warming up and pressurizing my room in a subwoofer like fashion, and I could tell that their bass extension was very good because it was just obvious. And interestingly, I found that kind of bass delivery to work well at lower listening volumes because the speakers still sounded dynamic and very full. And as we know, that's not always the case with all speakers. So that's something maybe for some to make note of. But I listened generally at louder volumes, and at louder volumes, I could find the bass to be just a touch too much, or just a touch maybe heavy-handed at times, but that was really amplifier dependent. And that's with, the most ultra critical, mindset, thought process going on. I tested several different amplifiers at several different price points, and I got good results from all of them, including a tube amp. But I definitely got the best results from an amplifier with a lot of current capability and a vice-like grip on the speakers for what it's worth. And the second standout strength of the Typhon for me is their musicality, which doesn't mean much. So how about their musical deliveries ebb and flow? And it didn't matter what amplifier I used here, I always found myself tapping my feet to the music because the underlying vibe and rhythm was very seductive, possibly due to that bass, that big warm bass, and how that underpinned the music, so subconsciously I was put in a very good place. But the knock-on effect of that was just I was more engaged in the music. And you cannot undervalue that for long-term listening enjoyment. You cannot undervalue that factor. And then another factor that really impressed me about the Typhons was their subtlety. Just little bits of information within music here and there that was just kind of presented to me just in a nice, subtle way, which was really impressive because in general, I found the Typhon to have a big sound, a very big overall sound. I was creating big images within the soundstage. So a nice combination of big images with subtlety and detail. And that was also impressive, I think, because the general mix of the speakers, which I found to be a little bit more relaxed and a little bit more easygoing, but still with a nice amount of energy and detail. And there could be a really nice amount of energy and more detail, again, with the right amplifier. But in the main, I found them to have a big and warm, more easygoing speaker sound, especially in the vocal regions. But before we talk about vocals and highs, I think it's important to talk about what happens when you adjust the angle of the speaker, because of course that will affect things, and this is going to be slightly different for everyone. When I started with the speakers perfectly flat, I was finding that there was just lacking what's like kind of treble within the presence region, the upper vocals, and just this region of sound that kind of lives maybe head height and above. It was just all a bit soft for me. So of course I adjusted the angle of the speakers, and I found as I got up to about 4 clicks on the adjustment, which I assume is about 4 degrees, that information that lives in the height part of our soundstage really came through and was really present. And the added benefit was also that it made the vocals sound crisper and clearer in that upper kind of presence, upper vocal region, which I personally preferred. However, I can see other audiophiles with different rooms and different systems preferring the speakers slightly lower, maybe at 3, maybe 2 on that angle adjustment, just to make the overall sound a bit less present, a bit less bright, and a bit less, or maybe a bit more warm. So it's pretty cool to be able to adjust the speaker to make that kind of tonal frequency sound presentation adjustment. Even set like I had them, there was definitely an overriding Sonus Faber-esque character for me with the vocals, which you may already be familiar with, but if you're not, I would describe the vocals as being warm and set back some. Delivered a little softer and more sultry in presentation, with both male and female vocals being strong in tone or timbre. So for me, that is a relaxed, more easygoing, more sat back slightly, pull you to the vocals type of presentation, which a lot of people I think will like and enjoy. However, of course, for some it might not be forward enough. The vocals might not be kind of clear and kind of punchy, or enough for them. And then for the treble, you can very much tell that you're listening to a soft dome, but a good soft dome that has impressive resolution. Details are presented crisply and clearly with no obvious zip or zing to them, which is impressive as the treble details were very present with how I had the speakers set up, not softened or lost like can sometimes be the case with soft dome tweeters, which again I think shows the effectiveness of that angle adjustment. And in the main, that lively, more present treble detail didn't fatigue me either. It was quite a nice balance of the two. Detail, clarity, presence. The treble's there, it kind of, pops in the soundstage. It has its own presence, but it's not fatiguing in the main. But I could find with some music that has maybe a little bit of emphasized sibilance in it, I did find that the Typhons were maybe just emphasizing that sibilance region just a touch. I was emphasizing it just a little bit. Now, I am particularly sensitive to that kind of sonic frequency region, and we are talking only just a little bit here. But I would prefer that. I don't mind that. I would prefer to have that little bit of emphasis, to not lose any of the other details in that frequency region, rather than taking the approach of, just smoothing it all off and softening and losing some detail in that region. And lastly, on soundstage, I mentioned the Typhon present a very big sound with big images across the soundstage. Left to right imaging I found to be very impressive for those who like wide soundstages. And I found them to sound really quite three-dimensional with great scale from their big bass. But the Typhon have not been the most invisible or maybe fully transparent speaker that I've had in here to review recently. They don't quite give you that same get out of the way, see through onto the music, clear window type of sound, as good as the best of the speakers that I've had in here recently. But I've got to be honest, they still sound very big. They still present very big, clear images to the left and the right, going beyond the speakers at times as well. So I think most people would be more than satisfied with that aspect to their sonic delivery. So I've mentioned amplifiers and the right amplifier a number of times throughout this review. So let's talk about it. I tested, I think, 4 or 5 different amplifier setups, different price points, solid state and tube. And I got fairly consistent results across most of them, I think because the Typhon have some overriding character, as I've mentioned before. And I preferred the vocal beauty from the Typhon the most with the Galleon TS120 SE tube amp with the Shug-Yuan tubes. But I also really like the vocals and the treble from the Bespoke Audio Passive Pre NAD M23 combination. But I found the best bass and dynamics and clarity and energy from the Typhon using the Lima Acoustics Tucana 2 Anniversary, which is a high current solid state integrated amplifier that can deliver healthy power down to 2 ohms. And I was told that the Typhon only dropped down in impedance to 3.7 ohms. So you don't need a monster amplifier here, which is likely why I was getting consistent results across different amplifiers. So I'm going to put my experiences with different amplifiers down to maybe characters or maybe, system synergies, if you think such a thing exists, which, it definitely does. It definitely is important. And I think the Lima has a very traditional, typical British hi-fi amplifier sound, which is more about emphasizing details and like a vice-like grip on the speakers. And that, just worked really nicely. It worked really nicely with the Typhon speakers. It really brought out a real punchy, dynamic bass from them, and it made them sound the clearest in terms of an overall soundstage with the most space going on, still with that nice subtlety. And that's been working really nicely with some of the electronic music that I've been listening to recently. Just got suggested to me at random, and it's been some really euphonic, easygoing, subtle, electronic, pumping bass type music. This combination works fantastically well for that style of music. I think lastly to talk about them would be any negatives, and I think the best way to do that will be with a comparison with the Wharfedale Elysian 3, because these are really like chalk and cheese speakers, where one shows the strengths and the shortcomings of the other. The Elysian show that the Typhon have an obvious character to their sound, and they don't get out of the way of the music in quite the same way. But it's their warm character that will likely have the appeal here. Let's not forget that important factor. The Elysians sound faster, more energetic in some ways, but with a little edge to their sound. The Typhon have a bigger bass, more suited to a bigger room maybe, or an away from the boundary placement. Their vocals are more seductive in some ways, but they're not as clear or maybe not as cleanly presented. So for me, it's a similar outcome from my last comparison of the two. The mid-range and AMT of the Elysian really are outstanding for the mids and highs, clarity, speed and transparency. But that will come with a more fussy of the system quality caveat. The Typhon are more relaxed, more easygoing, less fussy to some degree, with a warmer sound and bigger bass. But they are not as open or clear sounding. So which you prefer from both of these two speakers is likely going to depend on a whole number of factors. But I've had some fantastic listening sessions with both of these speakers. They're both very, very good speakers. So to sum up this very long review, the Typhon are expensive hi-fi speakers at $5,500, and you can buy a lot of other speakers for that money. Of course you can. So why would you choose the Typhons? Well, I think based on their looks, of course, you might really like that. What I think is quite a modern styling. I really like it. I think it's really nice. But sonically, I think if you like Sonus Faber speakers but find them a bit light on bass, well then the Typhons will serve you better. If you like a soft dome tweeter but find them sometimes to be too soft and not clear or cutting enough, well then a Typhon can serve you better, and you can also adjust them if you want less or want more, so they can serve you better. If you like a seductive, warm mid-range, warm sound in general, well then a Typhon can serve you better than others. If you like listening in at lower volumes, well then a Typhon can serve you better than some others. And if you like a big bass, then the Typhon can definitely serve you better than some other speakers. So I hope you've enjoyed this review. I hope you found it useful and helpful. If you enjoyed it, please hit the thumbs up button and consider subscribing to the Pure Perfect System YouTube channel if you haven't already. And if you enjoyed this video, maybe consider supporting the channel by joining me over at Patreon and helping me continue to make better videos for you